Okay, so this is week three. Make sure that by now you should have finished your second week. You should have finished the discussion board. It opened and closed. It closed last night, Tuesday night. So um, make sure that you did that. Okay, so welcome to week three. And in week three, we begin to explore some of the causes of terrorism. In the book, Martin touches on the social, the sociological, the psychological, causes of terrorism. And he touches on them briefly. It's not an extensive view, but it's kind of an overview. And so we look at some of the theories. And again, they're not all exclusive. The theories that there are other theories to explain terrorism, but he touches on some of the basic fundamentals of why people might become or what causes people to engage in terroristic activity. Be sure that you read the chapters. There's a lot of information in the chapters that I don't cover in the PowerPoints because obviously the PowerPoint would be too long, and you're responsible for doing the reading. Anything that is in the chapter, the reading, could possibly be on the quiz, so don't forget that. Okay? So without any further ado, we'll start to explore some of the causes of terrorism. So terrorism and its causes can be analyzed at more than one level. We can look at it individually, from a group perspective, or from a national perspective. The individual perspective is quite prevalent today as we look at the lone wolf. Groups can be anywhere from 3 or 4 people to large groups such as Hezbollah or Hamas. And nationally, there are groups that operate within a country that are nationalistic, that are looking to overthrow a government, and they're using terrorism as opposed to guerrilla tactics in order to gain their achieve their goal. In the book, Martin cites several different examples for each different cause, for each different level, and he uses Northern Ireland for the group level, and also the Palestinians in their fight against Israel, and he also uses the Kurds in Turkey for their fight against the repressive Turkish government. So make sure that you read about these groups in the text. Okay, so we're going to look at the different explanations, and we're going to look at a sociological, a psychological, and a criminological explanation for terrorism. So these, in each one of these sociological, there are whole texts written about that explanation of terrorism. So we're trying to explain it here all in one chapter. So obviously, it's going to be brief, and we're not going to explore each sociological explanation or each sociological theory to explain terrorism. We're going to look at it in a broad sense, both psychologically, sociologically, and criminologically, because to explain crime, there are many, many different theories. So, and the same thing with terrorism. There's many different theories to explain in each one of these categories. There are subcategories. So we're going to briefly hit on it in a broad sense, rather than again getting into it narrowly and looking at each one. So you can go on and do your own um, research and look at these different explanations more in depth if you so desire. Okay, so first we're going to look at some sociological explanations of terrorism. And sociology is the study of human society. So early on in the early part of the century, sociology wasn't really considered a legitimate field of study. And it wasn't until Emile Durkheim did a study on suicide, which incorporated scientific methodology and empirical evidence to prove his hypothesis, that sociology eventually became a legitimate field of study and is now used to study many, many, many things about society, including terrorism, but it's also used to study corporate environment, teaching, students and their interactivity with interaction. I'm sorry, with within the school. So it's become an important study. So when we look at sociology and terrorism, we look at the conflict between groups that leads to collective violence. In the book, again, we're going to just look at several theories. One is structural theory, the other is deprivation theory. And in the book, he uses a couple of cases to prove each one. Leila Khalid and Abu Nidal. Again, I'm not going to get into each case. You have to read them in the text. But we're going to look at those two groups, those two theories, a little more. He looks at them in the book. Obviously, Mr. Martin feels that those are two of the more affluent theories to explain why people and society turn to terror and terrorism. This is just an aside. This is not in the book, but these are some of the key sociologists. If you're interested in sociology and you want to read about them, Auguste Comte, Harriet Martineau, Herbert Spencer, Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, Max Weber, and W.E.B. Du Bois are some of the major and key sociologists that helped formulate and bring and make the sociology into a legitimate field of study. Okay, so the first theory we're looking at is structural theory, structural functionalism, which is sometimes referred to as functionalism. And it's a paradigm that divides social phenomena into parts, each of which serves a function for the operation of the whole. So it breaks society down into different parts that interact, and each part plays a function in society. It views society as a system of highly interrelated structures or parts that function or operate together harmoniously. A social entity can be viewed as an organism. So when we look at a society that operates harmoniously, that would be where all folks have equal access to government, equal access to civil rights, and equal access to all parts of the government and society. So when a society or a government, in essence, does not act harmoniously and all people do not have equal access to government or to uh, supplies or the wants and needs to make them make a people whole, that is when people turn to terrorism. So, in essence, a government that's beset by problems is vulnerable to terrorism. Some governments that have problems, say in the United States in our history, when there are social or economical problems like there are today, sometimes we protest. People go out and protest, and it's a civil, um, generally they're peaceful protests, but in other places where people do not have equal access to the government and possibly may never gain access to the government, they oftentimes turn to revolution to overthrow the government, and sometimes the revolution often starts out with terroristic activity. There's an interesting quote on page 50, which I think is interesting in today's current environment. And on page 50, Martin writes, "Popular discontent, the alienation of elites, and a pervasive crisis are the central ingredients for bringing a society to the brink of revolution." So I'm not saying that we're at the brink of revolution, but there's certainly a popular discontent and a dissatisfaction with the elites in this country right now. So it's an interesting time that we're living in, and it's just a little food for thought as we read on further. The other theory that Martin looks at is relative deprivation theory, and it's the other sociological theory. The criminological theories that we look at later on in the book, in the chapter, I'm sorry, also fall under sociological theories. It's a subsection of sociology in which we study criminology. but he includes this deprivation theory. So when a group's rising expectations are met by sustained repression or second-class status, the group's reaction may include political violence. We've seen this throughout history, where a group that has been repressed will sometimes resort to violence. In many countries, they resort to protest, political protest. It doesn't reach the level of violence, but it can. So Martin also argues that absolute deprivation should be contrasted against relative deprivation, because in absolute deprivation, a group is deprived of the basic necessities for survival, by a government or social order. And again, this can obviously, if relative deprivation can lead to terrorist activity, obviously absolute deprivation can also lead to terrorism. So when Martin includes this theory, he also includes a caveat. Martin says, although it is a popular theory amongst experts, there are three shortcomings that have been argued, and they're interesting shortcomings. One of them, to me, in my mind, anyway. First, he says that psychological research suggests that aggression happens infrequently when the conditions for relative deprivation are met. So, in other words, when people are repressed, oftentimes it doesn't lead to violence. It might lead to protests, or it might lead to other forms of resistance. Secondly, the theory is more likely to explain individual behavior rather than a group behavior. And finally, empirically, studies have found that there is not an association between relative deprivation and political violence. So they've actually studied this theory empirically and have proven to a degree that there is not an association. An association is a weaker link, but there still have been studies that have found that there is no association between um, relative deprivation and political violence. That's important. So here we have a little table from the book which shows the group, who belongs to the group, and who the adversary is. And we'll finish up part 1 of chapter 3 with a quick video after this slide. And it's about the Irish Republican Army factions. And their constituency was the Northern Irish Catholics, and their adversary was the British and Ulster Protestants. And he also, in the book, he talks about the ETA factions, and the secular and religious Palestinian groups, which we know are the constituency is the Palestinians, and their adversary is the Israelis. And then there's a little known FLQ, which is a group up in Quebec that has been active against the English-speaking Canadians. Obviously, in Quebec, a lot of people up there speak French and are still allied with France. So this will finish part 1. There's a